of text on a lot of slides. We won't cover all of it, my apologies. I do want to keep the camera trained on the slides. I think that'll be helpful for the audience in Great Barrington. So let's begin. Is Confucianism a religion or a philosophy? As Art said, I'm going to kind of leave that question to you. We'll talk about it. In what ways do Confucian doctrines and practices relate to HAD, hypersensitive agency, detective devices that Professor Josephson talked about, and CPSA, or culturally postulated superhuman agency? Well, frankly, you will see a close connection. And so I'm going to go to this next question. How did the Zhou Dynasty concept of Tian, or heaven, nature, or the cosmos, serve as an abstract, non-anthropomorphic kind of culturally postulated superhuman agency? That is really at the heart of what inaugurates the belief systems of China, as you will see, a notion of Tian, a non-anthropomorphic agency in the world that is of the nature of the cosmos. Was this concept durable? I want you to think about that too. It's a really interesting question. And so let's also, I want to add another dimension to this. How does this relate to what is being called cosmopolitics? An idea that comes from a political or a philosopher of science named Stingers, Isabel Stingers, a Belgian philosopher. And so how does Confucian doctrine rise, decline, and become reconstituted over the centuries? And how does this relate to Han Chinese ethnogenesis? How do the Chinese people become a people through processes of creating philosophical or philosophico-religious doctrines like Confucianism? And how does it relate to the political power associated with civilization? In Chinese, Wenming, civilization, we should think of this as a verb. It's a process, right, as well as a noun, a thing. And culture, Wenhua, which we can also think of as a process. And perennial tensions between the state, religion, and philosophy. So briefly, how does cosmology relate to politics and governance and creating an order that gives people a cultural identity and that sort of encompasses or supports political power, which has many other dimensions? Before we jump into those sort of specific questions regarding ancient and medieval China and even modern China, let's step back for a second. The last lecture really opened up some interesting kinds of thoughts for me, and these related to some of the things I've been studying in relation to possessions, both spirit possession and our assumptions of possessing things, our ability to kind of imagine or practice owning or possessing items, things, commodities, etc. So in this discussion from last week, Dr. Josephson often mentioned this word agency, which you hear all over the social sciences all the time now, in social theory. And so I'm kind of provisionally calling this the spectrum of agency. And I just put it together this morning as I was trying to wake up and face the world, get out of bed. And once again, I was waking up on planet Earth, where I have been formatted with the idea that I am a free agent in a world of dilemmas. And here I was trying to put this together. And so on one end, if you look over on the right, I think it's fair to say that we have in modern thought kind of consciousness or agency, the assumption of a consciousness or agency that it is exclusively human and it is neurologically based, largely. And on the other end of the spectrum, where we see, and we can call this modern thought over on the right, modernism, broadly speaking. Over on the left, let's go back to sort of our hunter-gatherer origins, if you will, and think of the 99% of human existence on Earth. Probably, I would guess, as hunter-gatherers, a lot of what we were dealing with in terms of our conceptions of the world were animistic. So over on that side, consciousness and agency, there's plenty of evidence that consciousness and agency are perceived as fluid and widespread or ubiquitous. So over there we have animism. let me put this idea out there while we're looking at the ends of the spectrum that I'm imagining. There's a famous social anthropologist named Viveiros de Castro, a Brazilian, who has studied Amerindians, Amazonian Native American cultures, and their animism, and he has posited that over on the right we have the belief that humans are on a biological spectrum with other species. We're related to other species biologically, physically, but we don't share culture with them. If we go to the other end of the spectrum, the animist end, it is generally accepted that humans share culture with other species, but that they are separate in terms of how they are manifest bodily, biologically, physically in the world. So only shamans in animism really can go beyond the bounds of the body and communicate freely with these animals, but many people are able, or plants or trees or rocks, but many people are able to experience this in some ways in animist thought. So, once again, a biological separation, but a shared culture. In primeval, sort of primordial times, it's typically believed in these animist cultures that there was a time when people and animals or other beings could communicate freely. So there is a widespread ascription of personhood to non-humans, okay? And I've experienced this with people in China, which will seem rather amazing, I think, when I talk about Confucianism. You would think it wouldn't be possible, but we'll talk about religious beliefs, folk religious beliefs in China, especially when I talk about Taoism and folk religion. So, looking at this spectrum, if in modern thought the individual is a rational actor, there's an assumption of a uniquely human consciousness and in the individual as an autonomous agent, whereas on the animistic end, there's an ascription of personhood to non-humans. Their spirit possession is common. And now there is a lot of interest among cognitive scientists, and Cohen and Barrett, an anthropologist and a cognitive scientists, have written about this and done research on spirit possession, which we in the West would think is virtually impossible for us. And when you start hearing, if you're possessed by something else, oh boy, that's a big, big problem. It's not something I might be inclined to tell you about. Well, you know, this morning when I got up out of bed, there was a voice in my head, and it was telling me to do these things, and I realized I was possessed by, my dog. Well, at that point, we say, well, are you off your meds? But in many societies, it isn't strange. There's a time and a place for it. It's ritualized. It's practiced regularly. And this is still true in many parts of the world. And so cognitive scientists who've done research on this, especially Barrett, have deemed it mildly counterintuitive, or MCI. And that it really isn't so surprising that people could experience this because we tend to try to ascribe personhood to things out there that have agency. If it has agency, it has personhood, and that if our bodies are being taken over by other forces, they argue that we tend to give full agency to those forces. And so typically in spirit possession, it's all or nothing. There isn't a real mixture. That would become problematic. We could debate about that. If you look at Homeric literature and look at how, any number of figures in the Iliad are sort of interacting with Athena or Zeus while they go about their warrior business, you could make an argument that it may not be that simple. But in any case, this is being carefully investigated right now, or at least thoroughly investigated. So if this is a spectrum, where do we put those things that I've just dropped down in the middle? Vitalism, notions of an animating force, and we'll talk about that in regard to Chinese traditions of qi, matter, energy, life force that permeates the physical universe and landscapes and people's bodies. Where does that go? Monotheism, the Abrahamic traditions, polytheism, pantheism, where do those things fit in this spectrum? And I would sort of hypothesize right now that any given belief system is going to have elements that fall along different parts of that spectrum, and they might make claims that there are different components, different forces, different agents that can be found in different parts of that spectrum. So again, cosmopolitics at the bottom. A politics, this has been called by Bruno Latour in his review of Stenger's work. A politics that will not be attached to a cosmos is moot. A cosmos detached from politics is irrelevant. So Stenger's argument would be that we construct truths. We're in the business as humans of constructing truths, and that this is inextricable from processes of political power, identity, building conceptions of culture and belonging, etc. So, to China, Chinese civilization and ethnogenesis, questions of how these people, the Han Chinese, develop a sense of culture, a sense of civilization, a sense of unity. If we look at the kind of if we look at the we can't really look too much at the Paleolithic foundations, but Paleolithic and Neolithic cultures of the Les Plateau and the Changjiang or Yangtze Basin are shown on the Huanghe, Yellow River in the north, really, and a little bit in the Yangtze to the south. And do you see any number of cultures emerging in the Neolithic, beginning to practice agriculture and make pottery by 8,000 to 4,000 years ago? And if you look at the Yangshao there, sort of over to the left, have any of you ever been to the Banpo village in Xi'an, near Xi'an, I should say? It's a big tourist area. Great. It's a big tourist spot that sort of shows the antiquity of cultures that are sort of tributary to early Chinese civilization. So you see cultivation of grains like millet, etc. And if we go forward, you can see a number of features that are really important for this question of where does Chinese civilization begin. And so if we think about ethnogenesis and the development of Chinese civilization, it's important to visit the idea of what is going on in a kind of a very material sense. And Mark Elvin, who wrote this wonderful, very large book, his magnum opus on the environmental history of China, The Retreat of the Elephants, which I highly recommend, talks about this as war and the logic of short-term advantage. And he says, the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age acceleration in the process of development was driven by a struggle for increasingly scarce resources between rival groups and a competition between warring social and cultural patterns to survive and to achieve supremacy. In this process, according to Elvin, short-term economic, military, and political gain triumphed over what might have been more viable long-term patterns, and the pattern of agricultural production, artisanal production, villages, towns, cities, commerce, and administration spread. He's concerned with the question of whether traditional Chinese settlements and traditional civilization was actually as sustainable as some people like to think. But his point is well taken in terms of the way that cities and military and agricultural production, trade, artisanal production, were developing in this very sort of competitive, regionally competitive atmosphere. Now, thinking about that and then thinking about really recent ideas about ethnogenesis, I just want to cite James C. Scott, who just wrote, he's a wonderful social theorist in politics and environmental studies, really. The Art of Not Being Governed, An Anarchist History of Mainland Southeast Asia, a book that just came out last year. And he argues for a radical constructivist perspective on ethnogenesis. And his argument is that we tend to think of ethnic groups, indigenous peoples, as having emerged almost out of the ecosystems in which they have adapted, to which they've adapted over long periods of time. But his argument is that cultures emerge in response to state power, and that marginal cultures, hill cultures, emerge in response to the valley cultures, such as were found in China, that the latter tend to be dominant. And so even language gets developed around these political responses to centralized power. And I would like to take Scott's argument and kind of look at the center too. How do those power centers develop? They too aren't just sort of naturally evolving features that just kind of fall into place. There are a lot of struggles that go along with the ethnogenesis, the development of ethnicity and identity in those centers, and Confucianism is obviously a key part of that. So looking at this idea, ethne is important in studies of nationalism and state formation. A group that shares a common language, a common sense of origin, a common territory, common patterns of resource use, and other culture traits is called an ethne. This comes from the French word. When, why, and how does ethne become self-conscious, and how do religious and philosophical doctrines play a role in this process? We will definitely think about that in terms of Confucianism. How did ethne become conscious nationalism, and how did this self-consciousness affect the production and reproduction of ethno-cultural groupings that constituted the nations that became the empire known as the Central Kingdom? China, Zhongguo, if you look at those two characters, means Central Kingdom or Central Kingdoms. And so how did Confucianism play a role in the rise and expansion of an imagined community, what Benedict Anderson calls an imagined community, a nation in which people who aren't going to be able to see in one gaze the entirety of the others who are supposed to be members? How does ideology play a role in that? How did Confucianism work to create a cosmopolitical order called China or Zhongguo through the centuries, through the longue durée? So starting with the Longshan culture from 7,000 to 5,000 BP, which you see in the top row of pottery, coil pots, hand-built coil pots. We then see the emergence of something called Longshan culture, the Xia, what the Chinese historically called the Xia Dynasty, from about 5,000 to 4,000 years ago. And they have a distinctive black pottery and some bronze technology. And you can keep in mind that Western scholars were very suspicious about Chinese histories that claimed that there was a Shang dynasty, which came after the Xia and lasted from about 1600 to roughly 1100 BCE, until they started finding all the archaeological evidence that there was a Shang. So we may be skeptical about the Xia as an historical entity, but we're probably talking about the Longshan culture. And as we move into the Shang dynasty in the bottom row, we have very well-developed bronze technologies, those bronze ceremonial or sacrificial vessels like you see on the right-hand side, evolving from those above in the Xia, and then various kinds of sculpture, and also oracle bones. If you look over on the lower left, these bones, ox scapulae or turtle plastrons, turtle shells that were used for divination, and questions would be asked of the spirits, and there would be a hot poker inserted into holes that were drilled into the bone or the shell, and then it would crack, and then priests would read the cracks and give the oracle. And then inscribed on those bones would be the request or question and the answer. So we've learned a lot about Shang Dynasty culture from the oracle bones, and we know that oracle bones even in the Longshan culture as well. Some have been discovered. So writing in China becomes a really powerful technology. I call it a sort of techno-administrative power, a tool of techno-administrative power, and a really important aspect of Han Chinese ethnogenesis. An ideographic script versus a phonetic script is critically important too. If you look at each line from right to left in this chart, you'll see first the oracle bone script, which is very pictographic, and the bronze script from the Zhou dynasty. You can see horse, cart, fish, dust, sea in each column. And as you work your way down, what do you see in each of those lines? you see sort of increasing abstraction, right? Less pictographic forms, more abstract, kind of more elegant, simpler forms as the writing system spread, until you get to Chinese writing that looks like what we use today still. By the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, really the fifth and sixth lines, that is still in use, especially in countries that still use complex characters, for instance, Taiwan. So you can see in the language, because it's not phonetic, you cannot take up this script. If you are, say, a marginal group of people with your own language, you cannot take this up and use it as a phonetic language can be used to write your language, your spoken language. It does not have a strong enough phonetic component at all. And so it has a certain inertia and a certain staying power, a certain durability, so that people use it as is. And that doesn't matter what their dialects are. There's a famous case in which a Yiddish scholar was giving a lecture, and he was talking about dialects versus languages. And you know that in China there are many, many dialects, but they're really different languages in many cases. And one of his students said, well, what's the difference between a dialect and a language? Isn't a language a dialect with an army and a navy? And that was a kind of aha moment. Indeed, a language becomes a central kind of, if you will, a sort of a technology for conveying meaning that has durability and prevalence and power over a large area because it's supported by something. And the Chinese written language is particularly powerful in this regard. If you compare it to something like Latin, which was based on a Roman alphabet that could then be used to write out all of what became the languages of Europe with their various their various literary traditions and claims on nationhood. So China has, and of course Chinese characters spread to Korea and Japan, where they were used exclusively for many centuries, or a number of centuries. And so this was really what constituted civilization. And so with the spread of language, of course, there was a spread of ideology. And in this story of ethnogenesis and this notion of civilization, constituted by writing and specific kinds of ideology, we see an interesting transition. And if you look over on the left, second point down, in the Shang Dynasty, there was this notion in terms of religion of Shangdi. Shang means high or up, and Di means something like emperor or lord. And so Shangdi was a deity who was considered the god on high, the divine ancestral figure. And so in the Shang, it was a culture marked by agrarian rituals and social stratification. There were Shang kings, a series of roughly 20 Shang kings. There was a lot of interregional warfare in northern China. There were slaves, captives, war captives were often used as slaves. Oracle bones and what are called sacrificial auguristic rites and rituals were very important. Arthur Waley, the famous sinologist, refers to this as pre-moral religion. Sacrifice and augury, fortune-telling, were the primary activities and concerns. And people weren't expected to be moral agents so much. They were still closer to that left side of the spectrum where they're really engaging with gods directly. And so your fortune is really important. And you can see similar processes arguably in the West, or at least, I don't want to make too much of a dichotomizing assumption here, but you can certainly see, I think, within even Greek classic literature, kind of a movement from Homeric literature. If you think about the Iliad or the Odyssey, in which the heroes are engaging pretty regularly with various deities, to moving up toward Sophocles and descriptions of Oedipus's dilemma and beginning to kind of focus on questions of moral agency. And then by Plato and the time of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, we're deeply moral, we're deeply caught in a world of individual moral agency. So moving from that notion of Shangdi, we see a similar kind of, an interesting kind of pattern. Zhou Dynasty and Warring States period, which is a feudal era. If you look at the right column, this concept of Tian, an impersonal cosmos, replaces the idea of Shangdi. And Tian, cosmological agency, non-anthropogenic nature, the universe as a kind of force, a presence, phenomena, natural phenomena that are matters of ultimate concern, that we are within, we are well within. Almost, you could perhaps call it a kind of pantheism without an anthropomorphic God. And so the Zhou Dynasty is a very culturally diverse federation of feudal states with well fields, an agricultural system in which serfs are working the lord's field in the middle, and they have their own fields on the peripheries in a kind of tic-tac-toe board pattern that is the Chinese character for well, so it's called a well field system. The idea of the mandate of heaven is important. Tian, again, that character Tian, Tian Ming, the command of heaven. That the idea is that leaders, dynastic leaders, are granted power through the cosmos, through Tian. If they are in harmony with the cosmos, then they have power. And if they fall out of harmony through their iniquitous, corrupt behavior, then they will lose that mandate. And so political order and governance are inextricably connected to the natural order. This is common, a sort of common idiom that people of whatever ideologies at the time subscribed to. So in the late Zhou Dynasty, given the extreme political competition, there are 100 schools of thought developed. Among these are, of course, Confucianism, Taoism, legalism, Moism, and we'll talk about the first three. Moism is a belief in universal love, led by a famous philosopher named Mozi, and we won't talk about that so much, but we'll talk about the other three. So I'm a geographer, I couldn't stay away from the maps, but if you look at the Shang Dynasty, which developed along the Yellow River in this agricultural area where there were forests, and then you see the faint yellow line to the northwest, nomadic pastoralism in the grasslands. And then over on the west side of that purple area, you have the emerging Zhou Dynasty, which believed fully that part of their national myth is that they gained the mandate of heaven as the Shang became corrupt. And so, if we look at that pattern of expansion, we see that's the Zhou Dynasty, which lasted from 1122 to 221 BC. There's a Western Zhou and an Eastern Zhou, and we've talked a bit about the characteristics of the Zhou, but some of those last ones in the left, the Iron Age on the left, the Iron Age, agricultural expansion, warfare becomes particularly devastating. There's rising trade with the South, but you know, what's really interesting about this is that by the Eastern Zhou, there are really many kingdoms that have gradually, or maybe not so gradually, diverging cultural practices, even languages, even though they're using Chinese script. And so things are getting out of hand. The center will not hold. And the Chinese have a saying, by the time of the late Zhou, the Warring States period, 452 to 221, there's an old saying in Chinese which is there beneath that date, "Fen bi he, he bi fen," and that means when we're together, when we're split, when we're separated, we have to reunite. When we're united, we have to split. It's just this strange dynastic pattern, and you see it recurring cyclically, and it kind of becomes part of the belief system, the political belief system of Chinese people. But it's there during this time in which you see the emergence of these philosophies, Confucianism, Taoism, legalism, these philosophico-religious systems. And so this is kind of, in some ways, comparable to the emergence of ancient Greek philosophies in a very difficult political times of disunity. So how does Confucianism play into this? And we have to think about Confucianism as emerging in a hotly contested period of ideological ferment. And so we're in a contest, right? The Confucians, the Taoists, the legalists, the Moists, they're all fighting for preeminence and fighting for attention. And Confucianism is arguing for restoration of social harmonies and invoking ancient sages that are the paragons of an older China, a golden age in which the political order and the cosmological order were in harmony. So Confucius calls himself a sort of restorer, a person who is reviving ancient traditions and patterns, not an innovator, explicitly not an innovator. So he invokes the Zhou dynasty sage figures, the sage founders, as sociocultural models. And he uses the concept of Tian quite forcefully. Society is a mirror of Tian, the nature, the cosmos. But he has a very strong humanistic tendency, as you'll see, or humanistic, really humanistic thrust. Service to the living is more important than service to the dead. I mean, he's talking to people who have already hundreds of years of ancestral worship in their cultural fabric and belief in ghosts and gods and ancestors, which is still extremely strong in China today, even though it's disavowed in many urban cosmopolitan corners. We'll talk about that next time. But this is a message that he is trying to be the purveyor of among the literate, among the elite, among the scholars, among the political leaders, that service to the living is the sine qua non of personhood, okay? How can you serve the dead if you don't even know how to serve the living? It's one of the famous quotes from the Analects. So we see this humanism very, very strong. He preaches benevolence, righteousness, reciprocity with your fellow human, especially man. A lot of this is, you know, it is geared toward males who were socially dominant at the time. Loyalty, ritual, decorum. We'll look at each of these terms. He emphasizes the 5 relationships. The human scale is the scale through which we can begin to understand the cosmos. He'll have no truck with the supernatural, with the mystical, really. But through the human scale, we can understand what matters. And so the 5 relationships, everything is hierarchical, but it's based on a sense of reciprocity, benevolence, compassion even, and feeling, emotion. This is really the material that holds Confucianism together, despite the obvious hierarchical claims that it's making, social hierarchical claims. So the 5 relationships are that one must understand and place oneself within are the relationship between the ruler and the subject, between the husband and the wife, between the older brother and the younger brother, between husband, wife, older brother, younger brother, friends, the relationship between friends, which is the only equal relationship. I'm leaving one out. It'll come to me in a minute. So let's move on. And then within that, education as self-cultivation. These are basic tenets. The person has to become educated. A person is not born with this kind of cosmological knowledge or understanding of the world. A person has goodness within that has to be brought out, virtue within that has to be brought out through education. So out of this idea develops a meritocracy, an imperial exam system in which people are tested on their knowledge, eventually of the Confucian classics, and they then can rise into the civil service accordingly. Another concept that, of course, is critical is filial piety, xiao, the idea that you must respect your elders. And we'll talk about Neo-Confucian as we go. But who was this person, Confucius? Kongxiu in Chinese, Kongzi, Kongfuzi, it was a rarely used name, but the Jesuits, Matteo Ricci, used this in the 16th century, especially, and developed the Latinized version, Confucius, to give him that word. The name Confucius comes from this Latinization of Confuzi. The Jesuits had a specific agenda in terms of how they constructed the notion of Confucius and Confucianism to show to the Vatican that they were dealing with people who were civilized and who were essentially humanists and not some heathens who were not worth spending time with. So they justified a lot of their work as translators and interpreters of Chinese culture through that kind of argument. And and that was opposed by Franciscans and others later within the Catholic Church. But in any case, that's where we get Confucius, and his dates were 551 to 479 BCE. He's born and raised in Qufu in the Lu state in Shandong province in northeastern China during the spring and autumn periods, which is just a period just before the Warring States period. Of course, we know a lot about him, or this, who we think Confucius was, through the Analects, or Lun Yu, book of his sayings and doings. Like Socrates, he probably wasn't prone to writing a whole lot, although he was an exegete and a person who commented on older texts and compiled older texts. We know a good bit about who people think Confucius was through the records of the grand historian, the Shiji by Sima Qian, which came about 400 years later. And Confucianism in Chinese is usually translated Rujia. It's really originally known as Rujia. School of Scholars would be a pretty good translation of that. So going back to this idea that Confucianism marks a very strong period in the transition from the pre-moral to the moral, that the individual has agency over his or her choices as a moral agent. Virtue is the word de in Chinese originally in the Shang Dynasty and the early Zhou meant or inner strength or divine potency. And then Confucius takes it and makes it into something that has a lot more to do with our interpersonal relationships and our own choices as moral agents. So it's a key idea, as is human feeling, emotion, qing, this notion that is actually, and you'll see this over and over in the Confucian literature later, that there's this sense that qing, human feeling, is co-extensive or at least connected with other cosmological phenomena. So we'll talk more about that how you feel, what you say, what you think matters because you are connected to natural processes all around you. Benevolence, Ren, if you look at that character, it looks like a person and then the character for two horizontal lines. And sort of, if you think about this in terms of what Martin Buber called I and thou, this notion of a profound regard for you as being the foundation upon which I can find my real self. Benevolence, humanity, that originally meant virility. And I'm wondering what that character looked like, a person and another person or something like that. And I don't know what that character looked like, but that's kind of an interesting transition. Confucius is really changing the meaning of these terms. Righteousness, yi, upright behavior is essential in Confucian theory. Ritual decorum is critical, li. Rituals and decorous behavior are essential. Our everyday lives, how we address others, how we approach others, how we dress, the music we listen to. Music becomes a means of reaching harmony with not only the cosmos, but with other people. And so the kingdoms that Confucius, he looks around out of his home in Lu and he sees how rulers are permitting these people to play crazy music. They're playing the rock and roll of their time or whatever it is. And he says, this is nuts. These people are going down the tubes. You have to have this profound reverence for music because it is what harmonizes us with the cosmos, even though we are the ones creating it. So music and ritual, tea drinking, wines, drinking ceremonies, etc. All of these matter completely. Filial piety, xiao, respect for the elders, the sense that, you know, not only the ancestors, but older people and parents are the foundations of our existence. We therefore serve them. There's none of this notion that we're the future or anything like that. That's a lot of nonsense. We serve them. That's why we're here. We can thank them for that the rest of our lives. Reciprocity, shu, this notion of like-heartedness. If you look at the top of that character shu, you see like, and the bottom is heart or soul or mind. Like-heartedness, reciprocity. The next one is steadfastness or loyalty, commitment to trying to be shu, to trying to have this really profound reciprocity with people. And that character shows zhong or central or center at the top and heart at the bottom. So centeredness, commitment to being loyal and having this kind of altruistic reciprocity with people. Wisdom, zhi, knowledge, zhi, homophones with slightly different connotations. The gentleman becomes a paradigm. The junzi becomes a paradigm, originally meaning aristocrat, but now Confucius does just very much what Nietzsche claims that Judeo-Christian thought did. Confucius takes these terms like the aristocrat, the noble, and he claims it for himself in this case, and he says these are morally virtuous people, and that what you were calling aristocrats, they can be xiaoren, they can be jerks, they can be corrupt, they can be idiots. So we're going to level the playing field and we're going to kind of make claims on your status on the basis of your virtuousness. I don't care if you're poor. It makes no difference. You can be virtuous. So the word at the top of this list, xiaoren, means small person, little person. Well, originally that meant sort of plebeian, commoner. Now it means people who are morally inadequate. And those could include emperors, right? Nobility. Well, they couldn't include emperors in Confucius's time, but they could include lords, nobility. The empire had not begun yet. But xiaoren, he inverts these words, the meanings. Sage, the shengren, he won't even claim sagehood himself. Confucius's writings, or the quotes of Confucius show that he was self-deprecating. He could never accomplish this. But these ancient early Zhou rulers were shengren. The good man, shanren, pretty direct translation, the fine person, this cultivated, morally virtuous person. The complete man, chengren. Chengren now just means adult. But the complete person, educated, self-cultivated. Fate, destiny. Ming, okay, that's part of Tianming. And Confucius said, people of virtue and moral high standing, moral cultivation, don't worry about fate. They don't worry about Ming. They're not engaged in excessive sacrificial augury. They're concerned about themselves and learning, okay? So for Confucius, the mandate of heaven, Tianming, heaven's command, isn't so much about these broad cosmological patterns as it is about you and what your Tianming is. How do you know what your destiny here is on earth? What should you do to live the full life of a shanren, maybe a chengren? And, you know, who are you looking at as a shengren, as a sage? What are you doing here? Follow heaven's leads. You'll get some insights into this. And then the 5 relationships, Wu Lun, which we talked about. And so it's interesting. These things persist. I had a friend in China who was talking to me about sort of my life. I was in my 30s. I was doing my dissertation research. This is a person who was helping me do field research. And he started quoting Confucius. He said, 三十而立, 四十而不惑. He went on this entire quote, off on this quote of Confucius, discussing destiny. And, you know, the meaning is that at 30, you take your stand, you get established in the world. At 40, you're no longer confused. At 50, you begin to understand your own mandate of heaven. At 60, you can kind of wander freely through the universe because you understand so well and you know you're following your path. This is very personalized, sort of humanized kind of a spirituality based on cultivation. So what I wanted to do is look at some selections from the Analects with you, and I have 3 slides worth of this. This is a lot, and we can't possibly go over each one, but it's wonderful if you peruse the Analects on your own, and the D.C. Lau, L-A-U translation in Penguin Books is a very good one, and take a look at these, and I think very quickly you get a sense of what it's about. So let's just look at a couple of them. And you can read ahead. Read them if you can see them, and see if there are any that you have questions or comments about briefly, and then we'll move on. But let me read a few too, out loud. Fanzhi asked about benevolence, or ren. The master said, it is to love all men. He asked about knowledge, zhi. It is to know all men. Fanzhi did not immediately understand these answers. The master said, employ the upright, which would actually be yi, involving rectitude, and put aside all the crooked. In this way, the crooked can be made to be upright. Let's move ahead. The master said, the determined scholar and the man of virtue, or da, will not seek to live at the expense of humanity, or ren, others' humanity, or one's own humanity. They will even sacrifice their lives to preserve their humanity. So, do you see any others that you want to comment on? Take a look at a couple of those, and let's move to the next page. Let's think about the emphasis on learning at the top. The master said, perceiving things in silence, learning tirelessly from others, teaching others without fatigue. What are those things to me? In other words, how could those things, arduous as they may be, bother me? Over and over you see this emphasis on learning and the thrill of learning, the love of learning as the heart of the Confucian, the Ru Jia or Ru Xue model. And moving ahead, let's look at this sort of, it has a little bit of an ascetic quality too. Let's look at 7:16, the 4th excerpt down. The master said, there is joy even in a life of eating coarse food and drinking water and sleeping with just the crook of one's arm for a pillow. To me, a life of nobility and wealth acquired by unjust means would be nothing more than scudding clouds. Okay? And I want to look at a couple of additional quotes that have a little different flavor. And let's say, let's take a look at the second one, 7:20. The master said, I am not someone who was born knowing things. I love antiquity and I earnestly seek it. So there's no innate knowledge for Confucius. There is a sort of humanity that does seem essential in people for Confucius. He doesn't explicate that the way that some of his followers did. We'll talk about that momentarily. But learning is essential. And his love of antiquity and his seeking out of antiquity as a model for our present-day action is also an essential component. His self-deprecation comes out too in 7:34. The master said, as for being sagely and benevolent, how could I deserve such praise? All that can be said about me is that I work at it without wearying, and I teach people tirelessly. Gong Xihua said, those are just the qualities that we disciples are unable to emulate. Then I like 10:24. It gets to the heart of what we do with our bodies, how Li, ritual, and everyday behavior become so important. And perhaps if it's so prescribed, one wonders how people felt about this sometimes. When he lay sleeping, he did not sprawl out like a corpse. They're talking about Confucius. When he lay sleeping, he did not sprawl out like a corpse. When he was at home, he was not too casual. When he saw someone who was in mourning, even though it were not someone close to him, he would always change his countenance. When he saw an official wearing his official hat, or a blind man even, if it were someone among his familiars, he would always greet them in a formal manner. He would likewise greet those who had suffered a reversal of fortune. If he attended a generous feast, he would always adjust his countenance and rise to offer his thanks. If there was a sudden clap of thunder or a violent gust of wind, his countenance would always change. And the last one, the master said, "Nobody understands me." Master Gong said, "Why do you say that nobody knows you?" The master said, "I do not blame heaven and hold nothing against any man. I learn the basics and carry them to heights. The only one who understands me is heaven." Do you have any quick comments or questions about any of those passages? Yes?
What is heaven?
Good. Heaven is a translation of the word tian that we talked about at the very beginning. Tian being this non-anthropomorphic cosmos, the world. It's certainly not a cloudy realm up in the sky. Tian today does mean sky, but it also means day. And so Tian, for people in the Zhou dynasty and later dynasties, was a concept that meant really the cosmos. And that is the operative term that I was talking about before. It's the world. Very naturalistic, very agented.
The concept of this cosmos understanding an individual's activity or ethos.
Good. In Confucianism, it's kind of kept a little bit out there in the sort of, off behind the curtain. and Confucius did not speculate about cosmological or metaphysical matters. And there are other passages in the Analects that say that. Why concern yourself with things you don't know? Knowledge really needs to be focused on the human. But Tian is sitting there in the lives of people. It's sort of part of the software of the religions of the time. And so it does get interpreted by a lot of people as something that is just critically important. Let me give you an example. I was doing research on tiger and human conflicts from the first century of the Common Era in 4 provinces. I was looking at archival records from regional gazetteers, and they actually have the oldest record of human-wildlife encounters of any society in the world. And I did an analysis of this for my book, The Tiger and the Pangolin. And sometimes when tigers would attack people, a lot of the time, regional officials who were Confucians would assume, because they knew people were assuming, that if tigers attacked people, just like with any natural disaster, there was a problem with the Tianming, with the mandate of heaven, that rulers and governance were out of order. And so they would pray to the tigers to give them a break. They would pray to the city god to forgive them for their misdeeds. And so this was a very real thing. It's all too often, it's not understood well enough in terms of its religious as a foundational religious belief. Yes?
The rulers or the governors accept this religion or this philosophy without being able to compromise their power over other people, because it is a humanistic belief, and rulers, seems to me, have often in China and everywhere been all of self-interest and political reasons.
Good. You will soon see that even though China is generally understood to have used Confucianism as the state cult, they also used a system called legalism as part of the hardware of governance and in the imposition of political order. So we'll talk about that more. It's often said that Taoism is over here, and it says that natural order will emerge, and if you have to use virtue the way that Confucians do, through virtuous example, to rule people, then you've already lost touch with the natural harmonies of things that Taoists believe in. So they say the Confucians are virtue Nazis who think that they can, model this virtuous behavior and that will work. And they're criticizing the Confucian Center, what I'm going to call the Confucian Center, for being obsessed with virtue, which is a human construct that the Taoists hate. Then you have legalism over here, what I'm going to put way over here on the right. And they're saying, virtue, yeah, right. You think you're going to rule an empire with virtue? Forget it. And they really seek the monopoly on violence. Frankly, the Weberian, since Max Weber wrote about the monopoly on violence, which is the prerequisite for statehood, for governance. And so there is a monopoly on violence that develops in imperial China. But Confucius serves as a wonderful sort of idealistic kind of idiom for governance when there really there's hard power too, okay? Does that answer your question? We'll talk more about that. Okay? One more question, and then we're going to have to move on.
How does Confucianism deal with the concept of hierarchy?
Confucianism accepts a natural social hierarchy. But, again, it is justified by Confucians as being held together through ren, benevolence, kindness, altruism. An active process of altruism, and even at a more spiritual level, the maintenance and continuity of qing, or human emotion, that if the ruler lacks ren, benevolence, that ruler will be out. That person will lose the mandate of heaven. So there's a tremendous responsibility for those who are more powerful to be good to those who are less powerful. Okay? All right, so we can return to these themes at the end of the talk. And so let me get into, you've asked really great questions because this leads into what happens in Confucianism, within Confucian theory, and leads to the rise of legalism. So there's an early divergence and a kind of reformulation during the Warring States period in the late Zhou. Mencius, a follower of Confucius, Mengzi, whose dates are 372 to 289, follows the Confucian line and makes it explicitly clear that humans are innately good. He uses the argument, this philosopher uses the argument that if you see a child about to fall down a well, you'll run to save that child before you even think twice. You're not going to think, oh, it's my neighbor's child, and my neighbor is my boss, and if I don't save the kid, I'll be fired, blah, blah, blah. You just go and you save that child because of this innate altruism. Sounds a lot like some arguments in sociobiology recently, that you'll act to save someone before you even have processed it neurologically, sort of consciously. On the other hand, another Confucian of about the same time, Xunzi, a little later, argues that humans are innately wicked, innately self-centered. They really are out for themselves. And so for Mencius, education serves to bring out the innate good. For Xunzi, education serves to rectify this badness. You will use education to fix these people who are bad, and they need to be reined in. Out of Xunzi's sort of tough love Confucianism comes a philosophy that we mentioned called legalism, or fajia, or realism, the school of law in Chinese. It has a tripartite foundation of governance based on power, shi, political techniques, or shu, and laws, or fa. And humans, it's believed that humans act according to one principle: avoid punishment and achieve profit, li, or gain, okay? What Confucius said people shouldn't really care about. The legalists are saying that the Confucians are just pie-in-the-sky idealists. To be governing effectively, you really just have to crack down on people. They have a saying, punish harshly, punish the light crimes harshly. Even the light crimes, punish them harshly. Cut the person's hand off for stealing, and they'll never kill anybody. You really almost have to create a kind of reign of terror over people, and then they'll be really good. That is the operative sort of technique for the legalists. And they take Confucius' idea that's called the rectification of names very seriously. In other words, Confucius made a small mention of this, and the legalists run with it. The idea that language had drifted in such ways that one word could have so many meanings that the written language and texts and philosophy just led people into a morass of a multiplicity of meanings. And so people just couldn't know reality anymore because there are too many meanings. And so the legalists ended up coming to power. And one of the first things that they did was to burn all of the Confucian and Taoist and Moist texts, and to bury those scholars who pursued those ideologies, to bury them alive, to murder them. So it was kind of like a Fahrenheit 451 scenario, and you had the massive attempt to replace any kind of ideological diversity with one ideology, and that was legalism. Reward and punishment, the behavioralist approach of what became China's first dynasty. So how many of you have seen the terracotta warriors? There you go. And all of those very lifelike terracotta soldiers are protecting the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, this first emperor of the Qin dynasty, which is the first empire. So using legalist technocratic techniques or methods, Qin Shi Huang, from 221 to 207, takes over a huge land area that becomes modern China and standardizes weights and measures and roads and weaponry and language and everything, and creates the foundation for imperial rule. So from 221 BCE on, we have imperial China encroaching upon increasingly large territories. Notice, though, that the Qin only lasted about 15 years. And so in the Han Dynasty, which extends from 221 to well into the 2nd century of even the 3rd century of the Common Era, over 400 years, the Han used many of the techniques of the Qin legalist system, but they embrace Confucianism as the state ideology. So this goes back to your question. How do you rule over vast numbers of peoples with different cultural patterns and different interests, political interests and resource crises, etc., and have a benevolent ruling system or claim to, and still get the job done? In reformulating Confucianism, then, along these lines, you have figures such as Dong Zhongshu, who lived in the early Han, and develops Confucianism as the official imperial ideology, and it lasts for almost 2,000 years, up until at 1911, the fall of the Qing dynasty. And interestingly, Dong Zhongshu writes a book called Interactions Between Heaven and Mankind, Tianren Ganying, and he notes that heaven, or Tian, had a consciousness that controlled everything through the 100 lords of heaven. All natural laws and variations in human affairs are decided by them. Human physiological structure, thought, emotions, and moral character are modeled according to heaven's will. Humankind is the incarnation of heaven. We have words, he didn't write this, but just note, the word for weather in Chinese is tianqi. And, tianqi is the qi, or stuff, of heaven. The word anger, pi-qi or sheng-qi, to get mad, to give rise to qi, expresses this kind of forceful, emotive quality. So whether the qi of heaven, this notion of this connection to all these things in the heavens, in this cosmos, this concept of tian, is interestingly stated there. So the Confucian imperial pattern, a meritocracy based on the imperial exam system, the memorization of classic texts, the 4 Confucian classics, what I'm calling outposting of officials, taking officials from their home provinces. If they pass the imperial exam at a high enough level to become high officials, you never post them where they're from. You post them out in other areas so that they do not practice nepotism, and you create a system of just administration. And of course, you use some legalist hardware, a powerful military, a very harsh judicial system in which confessions can be extracted through torture if necessary. So then you have a period at the end of the Han, in the 3rd century of the Common Era, of post-Han Dynasty political fragmentation and the rise of Buddhism and ecclesiastical Taoism, and I liked Art's characterization of that pattern. Confucianism fell apart when times got tough. Buddhism arrives from India and becomes pretty notable by the 2nd century of the Common Era, with temples and a pantheon and priests and a whole ecclesiastical system. By that time, the Taoists are becoming much more religious and creating micro-states in Western China. As the Han Dynasty falls apart and there is no political order, Taoists are using what they learned from Buddhism. If you're going to have a body of thought, a religion, if you will, all these things matter. Having an ecclesiastical system and temples and pantheons and texts, sacred texts, you bring these things into the material world, into the social world, and they have power and they give you a sense of place and connection. And so Taoism and Buddhism were very important. Why? Because they do explicitly give you cosmological reasons for things. It's not this abstract Tian alone. There are figures that, if not deities, for instance, in Buddhism, become deities in East Asian Buddhism, in East Asian Mahayana Buddhism. They will help you. You can pray to them and be saved. In Taoism, you get similar things. There is a difference between also Chinese folk practices and high Confucianism and high philosophical Taoism. People are every day, even today in rural areas, engaged in these sacrificial agoristic practices we'll talk about next time. People needed that. The state couldn't provide ideology that would apply and appeal to so many people. So you have a major rise of Buddhism and Taoism up through the Tang Dynasty and Confucian officials, and a disunity of China. In the Song Dynasty and the Ming especially, well, in the Tang, Confucianism is very important again, from about 607 to 960, roughly. And then the Song and Ming, a new kind of Confucianism emerges called Neo-Confucianism, and it's a renunciation of Buddhist and Taoist metaphysics. But it's also an embrace of some very interesting metaphysical principles. So Li Xue, or Neo-Confucianism, is a study of the principles of the universe. So some of the major figures involved in that philosophy are Zhou Dunyi in the 11th century and Zhu Xi in the 13th century, 12th and 13th, into the beginning of the 13th. So the principle, or Li, is in some ways like Platonic forms, principles of the universe. They're sheathed in Qi, or matter energy, the material stuff of the universe. We have a duty to investigate Li, these universal principles, and reach the supreme ultimate. So at the same time as they're saying we have a rational system, there is truth in the world, we're not going to go metaphysically deep into some kind of notions that many Buddhists and Taoists have, that the world we experience isn't real. We believe the world around us is real, but and we should, in a very empirical, anti-mystical, and even a very rationalist, and even somewhat empiricist a kind of protocol, go out and learn more about that world. And so, but at the same time, this philosophy embraces the idea that there is a supreme ultimate, that in a way that Tian, the cosmos, is, if you look at the lower right-hand side, a supreme ultimate, or Taiji. It is, that Taiji symbol comes out of Neo-Confucianism and not Taoism originally, even though yin-yang, the black is yin, or negative polarity, and white part is yang, and there's a little yang in the yin and a little yin in the yang. Yin-yang theory goes way back into the early Zhou. But in any case, they embrace this, and they develop this symbol that we all know so well. And you can see it on a version of it on the Korean flag today in South Korea. And you see the bagua, or part of the trigram system that comes from the ancient Zhou text, the I Ching, in the national flag. But in any case, they use that as a kind of metaphysical background for what they claim is really not a mystical system at all, but one that's very focused on human learning. This becomes state ideology in Korea from the 14th to the 19th century, and it's highly influential in Japan. So it diffuses out along with other aspects of Chinese culture. So we can talk more about that at the end, and actually we're making much better time than I anticipated. Confucianism in modern and, dare I say, postmodern Chinese thought, possibly, maybe not, we'll see if we get there. But Confucianism in the new China, and what I mean by new China is turn of the 20th century, the May 4th movement, 1919, post the end of the Qing in 1911, ushers in a lot of soul searching. The China that most people in the modern West know by the 19th century, by the late 18th century, the course of the 19th, and much of the 20th, is the China that's referred to by Europeans as the sick man of Asia. China in the worst chaos that it's probably ever been in. If you look at the scale, the geographic scale, the number of people who are deeply impoverished, addicted to opium, indentured servants, starving, diseased, the country really is suffering a period of terrible disunity. And so after 1911, there are a lot of intellectuals who are leaving China and going abroad for education in Europe, in Japan, in Russia, and as it becomes the Soviet Union, bringing home a lot of new ideologies. But one thing that most of them agreed on, not all, was that Confucianism was really retrogressive, awful, feudal, dangerous conservative ideology that had held China in bondage for a couple of millennia. Now, there were intellectuals who thought actually that there would be a reconstitution of national identity through Confucianism, but many really condemned it. And of course, by the time Mao Zedong takes power in 1949, Confucianism is associated with the slave and especially the feudal period in historical materialism. If Marxists believe that human history can be divided into phases from primitive communism to slavery to feudalism to capitalism to true communism, Confucianism is clearly and absolutely placed within feudal ideology. And to even entertain the notion that Confucianism is of value is to risk returning the country to a feudal pattern. So it's absolutely condemned. It's interesting, if we look today, Confucius's hometown in Shandong province, and Qufu is now a site for where there's a Confucian museum and people visit and honor Confucius. Of course, in Taiwan, it never died under the nationalist regime. I've been in ceremonies in Confucius temples. When I was a teacher in a college and university in Taiwan, I was invited as a teacher by the mayor to attend the Confucian ceremony celebrating Confucius at his birthday. And we go downtown in Taichung to a massive Confucian temple, and they're offering pigs, and it's a very beautiful, very moving, elaborate ritual. But in mainland China, of course, this was wiped out. But oddly, today it's making not oddly at all, actually, it's making a kind of resurgence. And at various times you hear these claims that Confucianism is precisely what has kept East Asian culture as civilized, as sort of hardworking and really valuing education the way it does, a sort of exceptionalism, a non-Western kind of strength. You do see claims of that kind still today. And in mainland China, official Communist Party doctrine embraces what's called 和谐社会, harmonious society, which I think has interesting Confucian overtones. And so I just wanted to close with a couple of additional slides. If we look at the treatment of nature and landscape painting, for instance, in traditional pre-modern Chinese society. This is a painting by Fang Guan in the early 11th century, northern Song, travelers among mountains and streams. It has a strong Taoist influence, love of nature, the very sort of phallic mountain on the right, very, looking at Da or a Qi, or power in the landscape. But to the left, you see these tiny details. Nature was depicted with loving and intricate detail of a mule pack train and a person leading the mules up front. And the people are a tiny little part of nature, not even visible unless you really look, which is obviously representative of this kind of nature of being in Tian, being in the cosmos, in heaven, so-called heaven. In 1973, 1974, jumping ahead to the Cultural Revolution, you have these very very different paintings where people are large. The landscape is transformed. These are peasant paintings from Huxian County in Shanxi, northern China, and they're a famous sort of genre of painting. And you have a banner reading, 把毗邻辟孔的斗争进行到, I can't see, 道地. And so it's saying, take the anti-Lin Biao, anti-Confucius struggle and carry it all the way to the end. And people are up there giving speeches, anti-Confucian, anti-Lin. Lin Biao was the second in command, and he was accused of leading a coup against Mao Zedong by Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, who led the Cultural Revolution with the Gang of Four. And so it's just a kind of an interesting example of how anti-Confucian Maoist China was. Today, I was in China this summer doing research on sacred forests that I'll talk about later on in the next talk. And here is a kind of an interesting landscape feature. You have rice paddy in the foreground. You have an ancestral temple there in front of that forest, which is a feng shui forest, which is what I'll mention later. A forest protected over many centuries, by many generations of ancestors and up to the present day. And in that ancestral temple, it was converted to a school in the early 20th century, and Mao Zedong held a meeting there with the Red Army in the early 1930s, late 1920s, and it's an important revolutionary site now. But it's just kind of an interesting conflation or kind of bringing together of the ancient sort of Confucian pattern in the ancestral temple with modern Maoist history. And I think that's actually what we're seeing in China today. If you look at a rural village landscape, and I spent a lot of time in rural villages in southern China. This one is in Fujian. Here's an ancestral temple. People have all kinds of rituals in these temples. There's a very strong sense of Confucian, a continuity with Confucian ideology, but it has a lot of local characteristics that are highly religious, that involve sort of sacrificial auguristic practices and beliefs. And we can talk about that next time. Here's a temple I just visited in July in Guangdong province. No, this was in Jiangxi province. And all along the sides of this walkway, in the background, in the middle, you see an ancestral temple, or a citang, where people make offerings to their ancestors, right? We'll see the stela that look like tombstones gracing each side of the walkway as you go back toward the ancestral temple. Each of those commemorates a scholar from that village, a homeboy. This is a village that took us 3 hours on a road that had been washed out in the rain to get to, way out in the middle of nowhere in the mountains. But I've been in many such villages, and many of them have these kinds of commemorative markers for local kids who made good. They were able, by the villagers pooled their money, they educated these boys, and those kids were smart, and they were able to pass the exams at various levels and become members of the civil administration, and thereby, at a certain level, become members of the gentry, sort of powerful landowning class, and they're commemorated still. Now, the Cultural Revolution, yes, did focus. Red Guards focused on targets like this that represented Confucian thinking. And so up near right up here just to the left and right of that ancestral temple, it's hard to see in this photo, you see these lions, these stone lions that have been knocked off of their pedestals. In pre-modern times, in the Qing and probably after the Qing for some time, whenever a local kid had reached a certain level in the administrative system by passing the exams, they would bring these two lions out in front of the ancestral temple, and then when the kid would, grow up and serve, that person would retire, they would withdraw the lions. Well, of course, Red Guards during the Cultural Revolution saw that as a pretty good target and knocked those lions off those pedestals, and the villagers still haven't found the money to rebuild them and get them back up on the pedestals without damaging them, and they were talking to us about that. And I think this is just kind of emblematic of how traditional conceptions of education, culture, power, cultivation, and sort of the political order all come together even in these rural landscapes. And in those rural landscapes, they take on a deeply spiritual kind of set of connotations. So back to our first diagram on the spectrum of agency. We can put Confucianism somewhere on that spectrum. Different aspects of it would go on different parts of the spectrum. I'm sure that it has some characteristics of of sort of European Enlightenment thought. If you look at Neo-Confucianism, a bit of a sort of empirical orientation, certainly a rational orientation, but also something much further over toward the left when we think about these enduring concepts of Tian, but also ancestor worship, rituals that Confucius himself apparently condoned because they cultivate order, but he didn't want to pursue in their metaphysical detail because he did not like that anti-humanist metaphysical emphasis. So that's it. I have just a few minutes for questions. Yes?
I was just wondering. This might be very simple.
Sorry.
It seems to me that Confucianism, up until the influx of Taoism and Buddhism, was sort of a horizontal type of living. And then with the advent of Buddhism and Taoism, then we got the pyramid type of organization, and that changed everything.
That's a very interesting way to put it. And I'm assuming that you mean horizontal in terms of a kind of imperial, hierarchical, large-scale state formation. Is that right? Yeah. Uh-huh. I like where that argument leads us because it's really interesting, as we'll talk about next time, that Taoist ecclesiastical systems get established by creating micro-states that have a very, very spiritual idiom to them. But I think there's something to be said about that. Other questions or comments?
I was just wondering what sort of rituals and how common were they in Confucius? Did they do a lot with the stuff you see in Buddhist temples or was it more abstract?
Right. That's a great question. And in Confucius's own time, it seems that there were so many everyday rituals that one would need to respect to satisfy Confucius, from just being decorous, just practicing decorous behavior. So ritual or li permeated everything that one did. But once you get this kind of formation of something like the Buddhist and Taoist ecclesiastical systems, then you get things like Confucian temples, right? And then rituals of that kind become much more elaborate, and animals are sacrificed and things like that. There are all kinds of rituals that would qualify. And if you look at the Analects, you'll see that Confucius comments on things like the court dances. How many dancers were allowed to be in a particular kind of dance marking a certain period of the agricultural calendar? Was it right or was it wrong? And he really had very specific ideas about what was practiced and how it should be practiced. So there's a big answer there. Big answer. Lots of variations through time.
You mentioned that there was sort of a revival of Confucianism. Is the concept of mandate of heaven part of that revival? Because if it is, it's kind of dangerous to the communists, because if you lose the mandate, you're out.
That's right. That's a great question. I don't see an explicit kind of elaboration on that, certainly not from sort of communist publications or statements, the Communist Party, obviously. But I think there is a lingering kind of conception of that. If you look at how the government handled the earthquake, the Sichuan earthquake, for instance, I think people look at that and they want to know. And I think it's like it would be in any country, it's a matter of state legitimation. If you can handle that type of catastrophe, it is a question of your worthiness to rule.
In times past, just the fact that you had a catastrophe like that, the river overflowed or you had an earthquake, was an indication that you lost some energy.
It certainly could be conceived that way. Tibetans certainly had that idea, but I don't want to go down, there's some Tibetans who did. I don't want to go down that path. That's a great question. I'd actually like to look into that more. But I think the response to it was in no small part, it hinged, the very active response to it, I must say, hinged on those kinds of concerns. Okay, I think we've run out of time, so thank you.